by the assistant professor Özge ERBEK, and the presentation called Migrant Thoughts and Resistant Images, Rethinking Political Cinema from Fukeiron to Anabasis.
Thanks. So since our chair has already presented to me, introduced me, thanks. I'd like to move on to my presentation right away because we have limited time, but let me share my screen first because I have a PowerPoint. Sorry, I just I have just a problem.
You can just maybe push the button right.
Is that showing? Do you see?
Showing the slide, yeah. No.
Okay.
But not like a presentation slide. It's like a.
No, I know.
Okay.
But actually, I don't see my presentation because I try to. I don't know why, but. Sorry for this.
Okay.
Okay. I will try again. I think it's okay. Okay. Sorry. In my study, in fact, I will focus on two movies from different periods and geographies to consider a dialogue, a kind of cross-temporal cinematic interplay between them. And my aim is to demonstrate the effectiveness of political art and commitment, not in a sense that it appeals for revolution or an action, but as depending on emancipatory potential of filmic images and thoughts as terrains of resistance. And in a sense, in fact, this study can be considered as an attempt to answer to the very simple question of what images can do in our contemporary age, because as we are living in a time where the rise of neoliberal capitalism that is currently experienced as a crisis and the digital turn have not resulted in a revolution, it does demand a rethinking of dominant paradigms of political filmmaking. In order to discuss the power of images and their contributions to imagine new political possibilities and effective modes of or alternative forms of communication, we will draw upon the concepts of scene philosophy and scene poetry coined by early German romantics such as Novellis, Schlegel brothers, and Schelling, and use anachronism as a method of reflection. So far, my first movie is AKA Serial Killer, which is an example of collective radical filmmaking made in '69 by a group of Japanese avant-garde filmmakers and directed by one of them, Masao Adachi, who is a member of this group and also a militant activist, belonging in the history of cinema to the tradition of those filmmakers who chose to use the camera as a weapon, even sometimes dropping it for a real weapon to fight for a cause. And the second movie, the other one, is the Anabasis of Mei and Fusako Shigenobu, Masao Adachi, and 27 Years Without Images, made by Eric Baudelaire in 2011. Baudelaire made this documentary essay with the collaboration of Adachi, following lost images and traces of his militant past, which is mostly a hidden part of a collective history, and his private life, for the most of which he passed in exile in Lebanon before he's deported to Japan and forbidden by the Japanese government for the rest of his life to leave the country. So their collaboration was conducted, in fact, from a distance. And actually, from now on, in the rest of my presentation, I will use abbreviations when referring to the movies because they have very long titles. So for the first one, I will use AKA, and the second one, May and Masao. I argue that the dialogue emerging from this encounter between those filmmakers and their films led to a discussion that goes beyond the question of cultural or aesthetic inheritance of militant or avant-garde filmmaking practices of the late 60s. And in this study, instead of replacing those films within the context of aesthetics and history of militant cinema, comparing and connecting them within this framework in a traditional way on a historical plane of the iconic legacy, I will exclude this logic of succession and transmission and argue that what survives enable them to coexist in a relational way outside of linear history. Thus, we will consider those films as part of an atemporal constellation, as part of a rhizomatic thinking and creativity in a temporal flow, reflecting, interacting, and transforming each other. And we will try to interrogate this encounter on the possibility to reinvent alternative ways of being and thinking in common across time and space. And to reveal in Rancière's terms a common space of thought through and within the cinema, which is actually, in fact, what renders cinema political. So this proposition goes against predominant conception of time, the conception of completeness of both history and cinematic image. Actually, we find this idea of an infinite oeuvre, work of art always in becoming, undertaken by an open-ended thought resulting from an active exchange and confrontation in the early romantic notion of symphilosophy, in other terms, performing philosophy together with sympoetry, which means collective working and creating together. And for early German romantics, as you know, the social models were aesthetic constructs, and this kind of social model, this model of community points towards a community in the making, recalling a form of collectivity freed from all temporal constraints and political submissions, to be formed by encounters, sometimes virtual ones, between singular beings, through which it is possible to experience the absence of predefined norms of and values. And this intensive form of reciprocal interaction is what determines and practice collective aspect and dialogical structure of oeuvres, and an inquiry into the connections between thoughts as well as between artworks, which are presumed to be endless and incomplete. So when it comes to cinema, in fact, those characteristics are especially to be found in essay and experimental forms rather than conventional filmmaking practices, in as much as they are resisting to all forms of stabilized and closed meanings. So the connections between our selected movies can be situated precisely in their essayism. And the aesthetic proposition of the film can be envisaged on the levels of dialogical form, figuration of thinking, and political engagement as characteristic of the essayistic approach. And a formal analysis of the movie at those three levels would show that both films rely on a dialogical structure, justifying the openness of the essay film. And this dialogical form is to be found in the collaborative nature of the films, as well as in the intrinsic feature of filmic forms, such as fragmentation and indeterminacy. And their engagement with politics may be depicted as relying on thinking process produced through images and sounds, and on their capacity to create a sense of the senses, a disruption of the order of things. For the purpose of time, because we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, a limited time, I will share with you just a small part of my analysis, focusing on the conceptual and formal inventions of the movies, which will allow me to reveal the relational and mediatory dimension of the films, generating new connections and ideas. So the first movie, AKA, is composed from shots of urban landscape, but the real subject of the film is a teenager serial killer named Norio Nagayama. And rather than filming the subject, the collective turned their camera to the landscape that the subject might be seen over his life. And they did it without imposing any narrative structure on their subject. Here's some images from the movie, images of landscapes. So by doing this, they sought to escape the consumerist gaze of mainstream media to offer an alternative mode of address, and they called their methods Fukeiron, which means landscape theory, according to which filming a landscape would reveal about the invisible social and political power structures in a society. By creating a form that thinks, giving way to the circulation of thoughts outside of linear progress, aka moves in fact from political imperatives, leaving the territory of militant cinema. Based on aesthetic and conceptual models designed by Adachi, Baudelaire's movie is also a version of landscape film. We don't see any of the protagonists never actualizing corporal form in the film as in AKA. And similarly, the locations showed in the movie are indifferently homogeneous. The loss of sense of belonging and difference seems to expand everywhere in Tokyo as well as in Beirut. And in a globalized capitalist era, urban structures are indistinguishable and reframed in a similar way in every city. Here, it's an images from Beirut, excerpt from a movie, another one. So Baudelaire not only applies this theory of Fukeiron into his practice, but activates his own cinematographic journey by doubling the process of thinking and reflection in an anabatic form, as we will see, with an investigation to the problematics of imagining reality and an awareness of the medium. So his films depart from Adachi's in many levels. Unlike AKA that seem to interest in the present, Baudelaire looks back, follows the story of a revolutionary movement and personal memories of Adachi and his daughter, whose oral testimonies are interweaving with both political history and a part of militant Japanese film history. Avoiding to make judgments or try to stabilize the past within a narrative framework, Baudelaire invites spectator to think through the heterogeneous components of the film to construct their own meaning in a dialogical way. And in this way, the film allows a multitude of interpretation and the work of the imagination. The trajectory of thought and formal inventions in the movie May and Masao seems to recall the very concept of anabasis that Baudelaire used in the title of his film, a concept recently discussed by Alain Bauduit, French thinker. The term Anabasis refers, in fact, to the narrative trajectory of Xenophon's epic story bearing the same title, the Anabasis, where he recounts the journey of thousands of Greek soldiers who, at their arrival to Persia, their guide and leader are killed in the battle, had to make a wandering return to their homeland without any mission to be completed. And Anabasis means basically a journey out and back towards the unknown, a return that is at the same time something else, and it has a philosophical resonance because of the deterritorialization that it refers. For Baudelaire, while Fukeiron is the initial method for the question of what he's going to do with images of landscape in his film, his path in fact turned to be an Anabasis. And in his film, Baudelaire and his images, as well as the spectators, experience an anabatic journey into the unknown due to the unstable context of meaning and reference. And it is demonstrated that the images can have indefinite effects. Thus, the concept of Anabasis seems to trigger and initiate a new conception and potential of the cinema when we understand the images and encounter, as it is always unpredictable. So eventually, with a counter movement back to the film in an anachronic plane, we can also see here an allegory referring to the circulation of thought between two movies. Moreover, Baudelaire's Anabasis could alter the way we understand the film, aka those AKA can be apprehended not as a theory film trying to deliver a complete closed argument about the questions that it raises, but implying different aesthetic and political principles such as uncertainty, incompleteness, and heterogeneity in its mode of address by refusing to produce over complete representations. And applied to AKA, Anabasis makes us explore and discover a structure that generates new trajectory of thought detectable in filmic forms that doesn't belong to Fukeiron. So let me finish up with an example. Besides and despite the effects of global totalizing forces of the capital and state power visualized in AKA by the homogeneity and uniformity of urban landscapes and human flows, the film appeals to the spectator to interact in an affective way with film movements and to depict, even though in virtual mode, emergent form of sensibilities for political transformation, which are not reducible to any form of political formation. So that's how cinema for me once again become a laboratory to revitalize and experiment a new sense of the possible and to imagine and actualize a common space of thought and a community in the making. And this potential of the cinema could also offer a way to overcome the current dilemma within the dominant discourses and assumptions on political cinema, envisioning only limited positions such as spectatorial identification or alienation. So thank you very much for your listening. And I stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Thank you so much, Özge Hocam, for your presentation.
I exceed the time. I don't know.
I think like we have like until 8 o'clock. We have like almost half an hour, so we have time. So for the listeners, do you have any questions? Okay, Nilüfer Hoca, applause again. Actually, the Özge Hocam, I'm also kind of working on now an article about essay film, and then so I read a lot of Nora Alter, Timothy Corrigan. So it's
you're familiar with all this,
yeah,
all the
kind
things
kind of, but it's a like how can I say, it's a like edited will be edited volume in the in England, but we have discussing now with the editors like because they are like saying that they're like a documentary film, the essay film, and experimental film. They really divide, I think, really sharp. What do you think about it? But in my opinion, I think if it's like essay film, experimental film, a film can be a documentary and also essay, I think. But what do you think about it?
Actually, I'm against the categorization, this kind of categorization. I use this term essay film because it's easier to understand, maybe to convey my, ideas, but I don't use essay film as a strict category. So essay film, if you know, Adorno in his article also says that it doesn't have any methodology. So I just use it because I have to use some, some concepts, I have to say, and I don't like this this kind of definition: documentary, experimental, essay, avant-garde, and yes. Actually, okay. I thought to discuss this just before the presentation, but as we have only 10 minutes, so
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. So again, our last but not least presentation